Hello and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host Greg Payne coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Cool Grandpa Podcast. Our conversation guest for this evening is Rodney Hopkins. Rodney is a good friend of mine that I've known since late 80s, and boy, that makes me feel old. But you know, Rodney, just to give you guys some background on that, Rodney is currently the GED program director and teacher at the International Sonoran Desert Alliance. He's also the head wood butcher, in his words, of Dark Hollow Woodworking, and also comes back to the East Coast from time to time to teach at the John C. Campbell Folk School in North Carolina, where he teaches woodworking and teaches some other folk art. They have a week there where they've got a lot of different classes, and currently Rodney is living in Ajo, Arizona. Is that right?
Yep, that's how you pronounce it.
Perfect. And now, Rodney, as we get going, anything you want to talk a little bit about? Maybe give us a background about the International Sonoran Desert Alliance or any of the other places where we've connected?
Yeah, ISDA, well, the town of Ajo is about 40 minutes from the border in Mexico. And we are 80 miles from the nearest town in the States that is bigger than us. And we're only about 3,200 people. So we're very isolated. For 100 miles to the east of us is the reservation of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Mm-hmm. For about that much to the west of us, it's all BLM land, wild game preserve land, and Organ Pipe National Monument. And then same thing to the south until you get to the border. So we're in an interesting position. The closest large town to us is right across the border in Sonoita, Mexico.
Okay.
So, but because of the isolation and because of the fragility of the ecosystem, ISDA, the International Sonoran Desert Alliance, originally was started to help preserve the environment in the area. But the people who behind it rapidly realized that people don't have time to care about the environment if they're concerned about getting food on their table, getting, basically finding work and all that. So ISDA started a whole bunch of different programs to help with workforce development and grant programs to help people get the things they needed. And one of those things they started was a GED program to help people get the skills they need to get those jobs. Oh, so wow. I discovered it, was looking for a place to move to, and read about an artist residency here where they've converted a 100-year-old schoolhouse into apartments for 38 artists to live in and work at. I was thinking about it, and then I injured my arm, and I wound up having to go 2 years without carving, or a little bit more.
Holy cow.
So I decided to fall back on my master's degree in education and sent them my resume, and it just so turned out that about a month later, the person in charge of their GED program had resigned. So wound up getting the job, and I now live right across the street from that 100-year-old school with the artist residency program.
Oh man, that's got to be fantastic. I mean, it's just got to be really creative culture in such a small place.
Oh yeah. And then they've converted. It was the old school, high school, middle school, and elementary school. The high school and middle school have been converted into apartments. The old elementary school they've made into an inn. It's the Sonoran Desert Conference Center. Huh. So they have all the old elementary school rooms are turned into individual rooms, and they've got a garden in the courtyard, and they do all kinds of neat things. Like during COVID, every Tuesday they've been doing a pay what you can dinner. So it seems like most people have been paying more than they were expecting. But anybody who can't pay at all can show up and get a free meal for 3 people every Tuesday night there.
Oh, that's great. That's so fantastic.
Yeah, so that's how I wound up here. And then slowly over the last year, I've been able to get back into wood carving and stuff again, but still not fully up to speed. And it's a little bit tricky working a full 40-hour-a-week job to set aside the time for it, but I've been working on it.
Sure. Well, and one thing too that I want to explain to folks is you've been a little unique in the sense of you've gone from Appalachia, southwestern Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee area to Arizona, on the border essentially, and then back again a couple of times, which is that's a pretty dramatic shift in climate and culture.
Well, the first 2 times I came to Arizona, I was a couple hundred miles north, up in the tall pines. It was still desert, but I went to college there in the early 90s and then went back there for grad school in 2010. And I laugh. I've got a big chopping block I made out of an oak stump in North Carolina that has now traveled across the country with me 3 times to get here. And it's probably about 150 pounds.
I think maybe I helped you load that into the truck. I can't remember
if
I did or not.
Oh, yeah, you did. The big old 3-legged solid thing that I chainsawed out of the base of an oak tree. Whenever I take it to craft fairs, people want to buy it and they don't understand it's a tool.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And it's interesting, those things that we have to have with us when we move, especially long distances. It's, we'll throw beds out and TVs and all these different things. And then there's some of these things where it's like, no, this is definitely going. I'll throw out, whatever to make room in the truck for this piece.
Oh, yeah. Well, and when I saw the log, it was laying there for anybody to come get for firewood. And I knew instantly what the base of it would be, because it was where the roots joined it. And I knew that it would never fall apart on me. So that was Ben. But yeah, I think that would have been in like 2002 that I cut it up and made it. So it's been with me now for 18 years.
Oh, awesome. We're going to go ahead and move over to talking about your granddad and his influence on your life. What we wanted to do was to have you introduce your grandfather to us. Give us a little bit about his background, where he grew up, maybe some stories. It is fairly unique. And then, of course, let's move into some of his influence on you.
Okay. Well, I called him Granddad. His name was Lacey Price. Lacey Ray Price, and he was born on White Top Mountain, which is the second highest mountain in the state of Virginia. And he lived his entire life within about 30 miles of that mountain. Except he was, from, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and he was a mule skinner. He was out with horses pulling timber out of the mountains, and would be gone, for a week or two, and then go home and manage the farm. But he and Granny had a 40-acre subsistence farm. Pretty much most of the food they ate up until the 60s, with the exception of like coffee, sugar, and flour, was food that they raised and preserved themselves. He had up to 10 cattle at a time, 1 or 2 hogs, and a couple dozen chickens. Butchered all of his own meat, cured all of his own meat.
Oh, wow.
Was literally butchering hogs and cattle up until his mid 80s.
Wow.
And doing it by himself. And the one reason that he never traveled so far was they never had a car.
Okay.
Like they never got one. He used to have horses before I knew him, but when I knew him, if he needed to go to town, he would either walk a few miles to town or he'd catch a ride with a friend that was going that way. But so I grew up in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, in the shadow of DC, and it was, to me, an incredible contrast to go from there, drive 7 hours down to Troutdale, Virginia, where where his farm was, and all of a sudden be doing without all of the things that you would take for granted there. Like, they had a party phone line where if you picked it up, you might very well hear your neighbor having a conversation with somebody, because there were 4 or 5 houses on the same phone line.
Oh, wow.
And they never had hot running water in the house. They never had a water heater in the house. They piped a spring off of the hill into the kitchen and into the spring race, and that was it. And they didn't put in an indoor bathroom until the mid to late 90s. And that was only because Granny started needing to use a walker, and they didn't want her falling off the bridge into the creek on the way to the outhouse. But even after they got the bathroom, Granddad I don't think he ever used the restroom inside the house. He just still preferred using the outhouse. That was what he was used to.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, it definitely different. But I know you and I, working at the summer camp, had the outdoor showers, and in the evenings, that was a treat to be under the stars having a hot shower. And boy, I would go back to using that. Definitely different from not wanting to give up using an outhouse to indoor plumbing, but I can relate to some of the niceties of, I don't know, a more simpler time, not wanting to give those things up.
Well, the interesting thing is they didn't have a shower. So when you bathe, you were bathing from a basin of water that had been heated up on the stove, and basically give yourself a standing sponge bath on one of the porches.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you needed your hair washed, that became a 2-person job. So you'd stand over the sink, and Granny or Mom would wash my hair and rinse it off. And there's something really nice about having somebody else wash your hair.
It's nice having that done.
Yeah.
But I
was going to say, one of the biggest and more obvious influences Granddad had on me was that he's the one who got me started carving wood. As I always tell people, old farmers, of course, never gossip.
Right.
But they get together regularly to discuss the current news of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So the local news, who was cheating on who, stuff like that.
But not gossip.
So, yeah, no. But Granddad's buddies, since he didn't go anywhere, they would all stop by the farm at the end of their workday, and they'd sit on stumps out by the woodshed, and all of them would pull out a pocket knife and start whittling. And, I, of course, wanted to be up on the news of the day, so I'd go out there and join them. And when I was about 6 or 7, Granddad, gave me my own knife and showed me a little bit about how to use it. And then that was it. I was hooked. And it's seldom I don't have a pocket knife in my pocket since then.
Now, was your grandfather doing a lot of artistic work, or was it more utilitarian?
Sometimes they were just sitting around almost like they wanted something to do with their hands while they were talking. So sometimes it would just be picking up a stick and sharpening that stick until it was all gone, and then picking up another stick. But then Granddad would also make things either that he needed around the farm or make toys for the kids. But he would never have considered anything he did artistic. I mean, I've got a couple little carvings of hatchet or axes that he did that are certainly artistic, but to him it was more passing the time while he did it. And then if he needed something for the farm, he would go ahead and make that as well. And as a subsistence farmer in Appalachia, when he was there, he knew not only wood carving and butchering, he knew how to tan hides. He knew how to do some blacksmithing, some fabrication, some construction work, some stone work, which really, in the region he was all essential things that any farmer needed to know how to do to keep their farm going.
Right. No, absolutely. It's amazing. I think we both talked about a little bit about the Foxfire books and program.
Yes.
Have you ever been to the Foxfire Museum?
I haven't. I keep meaning to. Every time I go to Campbell, I know I'm 20 minutes away from it, but I'm always so busy teaching there when I go that I've never made the trip down there to see it. When I was a kid and I discovered those books, I just absorbed them because flipping through the pages, reading the stories and looking at the pictures was like hanging out with Granddad and his friends back then. And, hearing things like they'd be explaining things that he'd already explained to me on how to do. So, but I've, definitely, I think now I've got 1 through 8 and number 10 of the Foxfire series here.
When, and I didn't mean to interrupt, but
No.
When did you start doing some more artistic carvings? Was that, and then when you showed them to your grandfather, what was his feedback?
Let me think. I was carving artistic stuff back when I was like 12 or 13. I didn't consider it that. I just thought I was carving. And then I remember a scoutmaster gave me a piece of wood, and it had been sawn into a cross section, and he basically tossed it at me to keep me busy and said, "I bet you can't make a chain out of this." And then I made a chain out of it. And so I kept carving all sorts of stuff. I did lots of wooden chains and the balls in the cages. And then when I was 21, after bouncing through a few colleges, I went to the one I graduated from here in Arizona. And the first class of that was a 28-day backpacking trip. And so it was on that trip I started. It was a 3-day solo where I was on my own with no food and nobody to talk to. And I started thinking about what I was carving and why. And I decided to just stick to functional things, which kind of, I think, was inspired by Granddad himself of, things needed to have a purpose to be made.
Mm-hmm.
And, over the next 6 months, I made a bunch of spoons that were really nice. They were at least as nice as the ones you could get at Walmart.
Okay.
Just a straight handle with a spoon bowl on the end. And then I realized I'm in Arizona where nothing grows straight. So why not follow the curves of the wood and start having some fun with it? And by now I've carved well over a few thousand, 2,000 spoons, probably over 2,500
Holy cow.
Since then. And I would show them to Granddad later, and he would look at the bowl part of the spoon and go, "Hey, you did a real good job on that there, Rod." And then he'd look at the fancy part of the handle and say, "I don't know why you messed around with all that nonsense." I could tell in the way he was saying it, he was picking on me, and I could tell he appreciated what I knew how to do, but it definitely went fancier than he would have with it.
Well, and he was probably looking at it as time versus benefit. If you're there to make a spoon, make the spoon. If you're adding some other carvings to it, then, well, you could have been fixing a tractor or
exactly,
doing something else. That was time taken away from another task.
Yeah. And I remember when I was, probably about 12 or 13, somebody had given him a knife, and it was a blacksmith that lived locally, and he was showing it to me, and he was like, "Yeah, this is a blacksmith. He made this himself." And I looked at him and he said, "There's probably one man in 1,000 that still knows how to do this." And that was when I realized the value of these hand skills that have, in large part gone to the wayside in our culture these days. And I know a lot of people that do what I do. I know a lot of people that do blacksmithing and other stuff, but it's certainly not common in this day and age, although some of those skills seem to be having a resurgence right now. I know during the time of me being injured, it seems like spoon carving with traditional tools has caught on among the hipsters. Yeah. So I've been out of the game, and now the market's kind of flooded with it. But yeah, so it was, he kind of instilled in me just the wonder of people's creativity of being able to make things with simple materials and just their own ingenuity and skill.
Now, did you have like one-on-one time? Because I know you've got some other brothers and cousins and.
Yeah, I've got my older brother and my little sister, and then I've got 2 cousins. But and both my family and my aunt's family lived up in Northern Virginia. So we didn't get down there, but we'd go down there a few times a year, and then in the summertime we'd go there for a week or two. But for each of us, there was at least one summer where we were just left at the farm for the 2 months of the summer. And with me and my brother and my oldest cousin, we were just there by ourselves with Granny and Granddad for that whole time. I think my sister and my younger cousin, who were the same age, went together and spent the summer there together with them. But that was, it was neat. It was kind of, as a little kid, it was a little bit frustrating because there was nothing that I was used to doing in the summertime was there. There was no swimming pools, none of my friends. They had a TV, but the TV only picked up one channel. Mm-hmm. And you didn't turn the TV off if you were done. You just simply pulled the plug out of the wall. So Granddad essentially would, in the evening, plug it in just to get the weather report. and then he'd watch until something that was just too silly came on, and he just instantly yanked the plug out of the wall, and that was it. Wasn't going back in for the rest of the night. But yeah, it was it was great too. And somehow, even though I'm the child that caused the most trouble down there, I somehow was the only one that did not get paddled or switched down there.
Huh.
And I think some of it, I mean, shoot, let me think. Granddad caught me shooting windows out of one of his buildings with a BB gun.
Ooh.
And I just heard a voice from somewhere say, if I see you shoot another window, I'm going to tan your hide so hard you won't sit for a week. And I dropped the gun down, and I never saw where he was. And I kind of later, I was like, I think it's because I remind him of what a rascal he was at my age, and he's probably more entertained by this. But I know once, Buddy and I both had BB guns down there, and one day I was standing back of the house by the spring race, and there was a chicken out by the creek in the pasture, and just from the hip with my barrel rested on the fence, shot a BB at it, and it just squawked and jumped up and fell down and never came up again, fell into the creek. And it turned out I had hit it right in the neck with the BB from a good distance away and killed it.
Ooh.
And I, of course, I think me and Buddy grabbed it and took it into the woods to hide it. And then I went and hid in the barn to not have to face anybody for it. And meanwhile, my brother went and spilled the beans to Granddad. So as I'm hiding in the barn, again, I hear him approaching, I hear his feet, and he just says, well, I know what you did with that chicken. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. And he said, well, that's good you're sorry. He said, now you need to go out in the woods and get it, because your granny's got a pot of water boiling. You're going to pluck that chicken and we're going to have it for dinner.
Oh, wow.
So I did, and I was so emotional by the time dinner came that I wasn't able to eat a bite of it. But like I said, I'm the only one that did that. So somehow I did not get switched. But I do remember maybe a couple of weeks later, everybody else had left except for me and Granddad. They'd all gone to town, and he came to me, and he had his 22 pistol in his pocket. And he said, I need you to come with me. And I said, okay. And we went out past the barn and past the pigsty to a smaller barn, and opened it up, and there was one chicken sitting there and a bunch of hay. And Granddad looked at me and he said, now that chicken is sick, and I need you to kill that chicken or it'll get all the other chickens sick. So I had to, right next to him with the 22 pistol, kill this chicken. And it took me a while. It was, a good time later that I realized that was a very deliberate move on his part to teach me that you don't shoot something unless it's an absolute necessity. And that necessity would be that it's for the greater good, either that it's feeding the family, or that, it's like that one was sick and would have contaminated the rest of the flock. But, that lesson definitely stuck with me. And, I eventually became a certified, shooting instructor for the NRA for the jobs I had at the Boy Scout camp. But I always, from then on, took guns very seriously, and have never fired at a living thing since then. So,
well, and it sounds like your grandfather, versus sitting down and talking you through a lesson, used much more of that experience, and then maybe, hey, he's going to give you a short sentence, and then it's like lesson learned, right? Yeah.
And it was kind of like with the plucking the chicken. It was the punishment needs to fit the crime here, and it can't just be a punishment. It has to serve something else too. So it was, a lesson, and it provided food for the family that night. But, it certainly didn't give me the impression that it was okay for me to kill a chicken. Because I don't know if you've ever plucked a chicken, but it ain't fun.
It takes a long time. And
takes a long time, and the water they put it in is scalding, so it's kind of rough on your hands too.
Yeah. Now, what do you think, and what do you remember about your grandfather's influence with you as you started to get into your late teens and early 20s, and leaving home and all that?
Yeah, one of the big ones was that you could get by without a lot of things that that most people these days think of as absolute necessities, but really are luxuries. Especially growing up in Northern Virginia, to go to Troutdale and not have hot water you could just turn on and get hot water. To not have an indoor bathroom in the middle of the night, you grabbed a flashlight and went out to the outhouse. So I learned a lot about, there's a difference between what you need and what you want. And that it was the what you need stuff that was, so much more important, and that anything else was gravy. And that also the things that you do want can still be pretty simple and still bring you a lot of joy.
Yeah.
So that, and of course I grew up as a kid in the 80s in Virginia. So I had football card collections and tons of toys and eventually video games, but I still had in me that knowledge that, all of this is extra, and that really to have a good life, you just need what it is you need to survive and people that you love around you. And another thing he taught me, and I think it's common in rural areas and harsh environments, which is that you need each other. Yeah. It's community. And you might live next door to somebody who you disagree with on every single thing. And yet, if you're sick, he's the one showing up to milk your cows in the morning. And you would do the same for him. And it matters not at all that you differ religiously, politically, or anything else. You're still the community. You're still right there with each other. And wow. That's something that has strongly stuck with me. And, and once again, I'm living in a small, rural, isolated town where that applies, where, I've got neighbors who we don't see eye to eye on anything. And yet if they needed something, I'd be there to help them. They'd be there to help me. Yeah. And I think that's another thing that's kind of gotten lost in our society these days.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point, because I think to what you're saying is we've got so much that it's hard to remember that we do need each other, right? Because I've got indoor plumbing, I've got hot water, I've got internet, I've got all these different things. But at the same time, that also creates that isolation from going out and helping your neighbor. When they've got a flat tire, they can call AAA. But
well, and on social media, it's easy to just interact with people that you agree with on everything.
Yeah.
And, in real life, if you're walking through town, you're going to be interacting with people all over the spectrum on things.
Oh, absolutely.
And again, in smaller rural communities and harsh environments, you absolutely need each other to get by.
Right.
Or you're going to have a really rough time of it.
Now, one thing I know that you did share when we were up there in Galax was just that area, and just, how beautiful it was, and how that land and everything around there was so fantastic, yet incredibly isolated. There was a few, I think, tobacco processing and growing facilities, and then there was also some furniture and maybe some textile, but very small scale. So everybody had the farms, everybody had, basically you had to grow your own food, but then you might go into town, make a little bit of money to get the extras.
And where Granddad lived, it was 45 minutes at least to the nearest grocery store. So when they went, they would stock up on tons of stuff. But still, 10 years after Granny passed, you could still go into her cellar and probably live for a few months off of what she had canned in there, because it was still in there and still good. But sadly, that area, there's still a lot of farms there. There's still a lot of places that are growing for themselves, and a lot of cattle ranching going on there. But sadly, a lot of that really good farmland has been turned into Christmas tree farms now. And those, Granddad really did not like that. And he could watch them creeping up on the hillside, far away from his house, but you could still see them. And, once I lived there, I realized too that Christmas tree farms are one of the highest one of the industries that uses the highest amount of pesticides and herbicides. So it's having that industry is having a devastating impact on the health of the creeks and rivers in that area, because of all that runoff of those chemicals are killing them off.
Right.
Whereas Granddad's way of farming worked with the land. It was, part of the land. He remembered too what it was like to have to clear pasture by hand with a horse, ripping out, cutting down trees and ripping out stumps. And to him, the idea that you would take a good pasture and plant trees in it was completely abhorrent.
Well, when you're trying to grow crops, corn or, things to eat or even things to go sell, the last thing you want to do is start planting a bunch of trees where you just spent all that time clearing that acreage.
Yeah. And about the only crop I ever knew him to grow to sell was tobacco. He would grow it, and then he had a huge barn with a loft, and he would have it all hanging up there on tobacco sticks to dry out in the barn and cure it. And then some of that he would keep himself and twist into big kind of pigtail twists of tobacco for him to use himself.
Okay.
And then the rest of it was, like I said, the only thing I remember him ever taking to a market to sell, because the region he was in was really known for its tobacco. But yeah, everything else he grew was, for himself or for other family or for neighbors. And in Fairfax, Virginia, we went into our carport and there was a little storage room, and you open the storage room up, and hanging on a hook was a Virginia smoked cured ham about 3 foot tall. Wow. Every year that when he butchered hogs, he'd give one to Mom, and she'd hang it up there and go out in the morning with a butcher knife and cut a slab off of it and throw it in a skillet. And I remember at one point being positive I was the only one in Fairfax County that had that hanging in the storeroom off the driveway.
Oh yeah. Well, I grew up in that county too. And I can just imagine, if the neighbors had seen, what was in the storage and, some of the conversations that had to have gone on when your mom and dad were like, "Hey, take a look at this. I've got a quarter of a pig hanging in the storage."
Yeah. And yet, when you could go to a store and you could get a Virginia smoked cured ham and it'd be like 1.5 feet tall, and I'd laugh and I'd be like, "What did you kill, a baby hog?" Because that's not, they get huge.
What was that, piglet?
Yeah, exactly. But it was tasty. And when, there were some other folks in the area up there who had also come from rural places, and when they'd see it, it was almost like it threw them back in time. So like, "Oh my gosh, I remember that." But yeah, Granddad had a smokehouse in back of his house, and there was, as they say, nothing wasted of the pig but its oink.
Sure.
I remember going in there, and the head would be laying there, the tongue would be laying there, all getting cured, and the feet and everything else being cured to make food with. And I was never brave enough to try tongue or head cheese or pig's feet or any of that, but I was certainly a fan of his ham.
Now, as your grandfather got older and you were growing up and things, what were some of the lessons and some of the discussions? Because it certainly transitions when you're a young kid and you shot the chicken with the BB gun and, going through this life transition to when you're older and he's older, and it becomes much more, I think, conversation and a little bit of sharing life secrets. And what were some of those impressions and moments you had?
Oh, I remember one of them that stuck with me was to never be afraid to walk away from a bad situation, even if you feel like you might be losing face. Because I know, like I said, he spent most of his life working in the timber, and decided at one point when he had the 2 girls that, he wanted to make more money for the family. So he left the job working in the timber and went to go work in a mine in West Virginia. And he said he worked there about a week. And this was old back in the day. They were lowering people into a vertical shaft, him and 3 other men. Then they were in a huge bucket being lowered down the shaft to go to work. And the winch broke up top. And they got stuck halfway down the shaft with no way to get up or down from it. And they were there for many, many hours. And it was wintertime. And they were worried at one point that they wouldn't be getting enough oxygen down there. So they had some huge fans brought in and were blowing air down, which was actually freezing them. So they had them shut it off. And then eventually they got enough horses together to make a team to pull this huge bucket with 4 men out of it all the way out of the shaft. And all 4 of them went to the hospital when they got out. Granddad told me he never saw any of the 3 men he was stuck with, for that day. But he said as soon as he got out of the hospital, he went to the mine office, told him he was quitting, got his paycheck, and then walked home from West Virginia to Troutdale, which was not a short walk.
Yeah.
But, dropped his stuff at the house and went back out to his foreman in the woods in the timber and got his job back there.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So, and I remember him telling me too that, back then, I don't know what wages weren't much. I want to say it was probably at most $1 a day or $5 a week for working out there. Mm-hmm. He went to the cook at the camp, had a little son that was probably 5 or 6. And Granddad said he went to that little boy right off the bat and said, I'll give you 25 cents a week if you make sure there's always a cup of ice water at my table. So, and he did. And I was like, okay, so Granddad, he's not making much money. He's working his butt off, but he still appreciates something as simple as a good, clean glass of spring water and wants to help out somebody else, some little kid.
Wow.
And he definitely had a soft spot for young kids and for people with developmental disabilities. He had a way of interacting with them where it was a loving picking on them. And he loved it when they picked right back at him.
Wow, what a memory. But, we've been talking for a while, and this is awesome memories, and what an influence your grandfather had on you. This is incredible. And as we wrap up, would you mind sharing a favorite story or experience as kind of the cherry on top with this conversation?
Well, I remember, I guess I was 19 or so, and I started letting my hair grow long. And I was worried about dealing with Granny and Granddad because over the years I'd heard him say many judgmental things about guys with long hair, hippies, essentially, which always puzzled me because in the 80s, it was the people that they would have called hippies that actually most related to the living off of the land way of life that they had. But because I didn't want them to think less of me, there was actually a couple years when I didn't go visit them. Wow. And I remember Granddad had to go to the hospital. I think it was, he wound up having colon cancer. So I very carefully had put my hair up under my hat. And I think I had a cousin even put some bobby pins to keep it up there, and then went and visited with them. And then when I left, it was Granny who looked at my sister and said, it was good to see him. And she said, I hope he doesn't think he's fooling us by putting his hair up under his hat like that. and Granddad, from then on, he would pick on me about it, or about my facial hair, because he was always clean shaven and always had the same kind of crew cut on his head all the time. And then one day he was talking to my mom, and he said, well, I don't think I'm going to pick on Rod about his hair anymore. And she was kind of surprised and said, well, why? And she said, he said, I've spent days walking in the woods with him. I've spent days doing hard work with him, out in the sun, hauling rocks and stuff. And said, I ain't never even heard the boy cuss, so I reckon he's all right.
Oh, wow. Wow. Oh,
but
man.
There were a few things like that too, which also led me to know that, essentially you're never too old to grow and to change. That,
right.
He had this attitude towards guys with long hair for a long time. And yet when actually confronted with it, it was one of those things where he was like, okay, I'm willing to look at things differently than I've always have. So that was kind of inspiring to think, okay, here you are, in your 80s, and you're, completely willing to rethink something you've had strong thoughts about for decades.
Right. Well, and unless you had grown your hair out and started growing the beard and everything else, he may never have considered that. That was maybe an indirect lesson that you had for your grandfather.
Oh, yeah. And he used to cut hair, and he told me about once he had, in the 70s, I think somebody had hiked off the Appalachian Trail into Troutdale and was told that he cut hair, and the guy had long hair and he just wanted a little bit cut off of it. And Granddad said he sat down in the chair, and Granddad just went, and like crew cut instantly. And I was just kind of like, he joked with me about doing that. But he really did.
But he actually had done that before.
He had actually done that, like in the 70s to somebody. You know, it's like, oh, okay. Well, and I think, I don't know if you have time for it or not, but I was just thinking about, I had told you about the tractor that he built.
Sure.
He built his own flatbed tractor out of a walk-behind gas-powered rototiller, which was, it has the two handles coming up on the yoke and two tires and the blades. But he welded a bracket on the back of that and put a big metal pipe on it that he connected to a flatbed that he had made that had car tires, and there was a big rope on a stick he would pull for a brake on the back wheel. But it was perfect. The flatbed was less than 2 feet off the ground, so it was easy to load up with logs or firewood or rocks. And he used that thing for decades. And when it finally completely died on him, somebody gave him like a fairly new Kubota lawn tractor that he used for about a week before he decided it was entirely worthless compared to the tractor he had made.
Oh, wow.
So that also made me realize that, if you make something and it works how you need it to do, it doesn't matter if you made it pretty, as long as you made it functional. And, I've definitely applied that to my own self when I'm repairing things that I have, like pottery that I really like. If it gets a crack in it, I've got Granny's butter churn here that had a crack in it, and he wrapped some heavy electrical tape around one part and then cinched it with a wire and sealed the crack up. So it's now still a functioning butter churn. And I've done the same thing from looking at how he did it. I've done the same thing with a pottery mug that I just love. When it cracked, I was like, oh, wait a second, I know how to fix this. And of course, it doesn't look like, it looks like a pottery mug that has a repair job done on it, but it still works perfectly years later. So I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Well, it's that utilitarian, background that he grew up with and had to grow up with. There wasn't, 10 mugs for $1 at Walmart. It was, hey, this is it. And
exactly. And it's, do you want a pretty mug, or do you want to have no mug? Because your choice is to either fix the one you have or wait until you come across another one.
Exactly. And when you need that cup of coffee in the morning, you want that mug.
Oh, yes. And then you might not know. Do you know the secret of, do you know what saucering and blowing is?
No, I don't.
Because that's how he drank his coffee. I've got his old coffee mug here and his saucer, but he would get it in a big old mug and it was piping hot. And then when he wanted to drink it, he would pour it from the mug into the saucer and blow on it because it had more surface area and it cooled off quicker. And then he would drink it out of the saucer and then just simply pour more coffee from the mug into it. And it was years later, I was listening to an old mini Pearl set about somebody running into a diner who was in a hurry. And the old timer next to him said, why don't you just take my coffee? I've already got it saucered and blowed for you. And I've got Granddad's old coffee mug and saucer here. And I distinctly remember that every morning. It was his coffee being poured into a saucer and then him sipping it out of the saucer instead of the cup.
Never heard of that before. That's interesting.
Well, it's kind of, even growing up, I was aware that my grandparents were kind of a different era than anybody else's grandparents I knew. Like, it always felt like my grandparents were a generation older than everybody else's grandparents, because everybody I knew, their grandparents, lived in suburbs or cities or at least bigger towns. But, they were still on the same farm they'd been in since the 20s or 30s there. So I guess since the 30s. Yeah.
Well, Rodney, I really appreciate you sharing these great stories and examples of the influence that your grandfather had on you. And if you can hang on just a minute, I'll say goodbye after we close up. But again, really appreciate it. And we'll be sure to put the links to these different programs that you're affiliated with on the website. And if anybody wants to check them out, they can definitely go to the website and click on those links and learn a little bit more about, the ISDA and Dark Hollow Woodworking and even the Campbell School.
Okay. Well, I hope I didn't ramble too much. It was hard trying to figure out how to limit the stories of Granddad down to the time. So.
No, it's surprising because we talk about how long we want the conversations to go, and almost everybody definitely has more stories of the impact that grandfathers have on them as both little kids and then as grown adults, and what those experiences carry over through their lives. So really appreciate you sharing this with us. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.